So I think we've got enough for a show now. So a very warm welcome to our panelists and for everyone who's signing up, linking in on Zoom to join us this morning. My name's Jonathan Warren. I'm the Chief Executive of Localis, and great pleasure to announce the launch of our report, Renewing Neighbourhood Democracy, Creating Powerful Communities. And very glad we've got a top panel to debate some of the key issues from here. And by a top panel, I mean Danny Kruger, MP for Devizes, author of Levelling Up Our Communities. Great pleasure to welcome from Wigan, Alison Mackenzie-Folan, Chief Executive of Wigan Council. From the Garden of Kent, great to have award-winning journalist and political advisor, Joe Phillips. And lastly, but by no means least, Rayhan Hack, Senior Policy Advisor for Local Trust, who sponsored Localis' research into what's necessary to make the reality of double devolution happen for us. So thanks so much for Local Trust. We're going to kick on with this very quickly, but before we do, a few more quick thanks. Huge gratitude to my esteemed Localis research colleagues, Joe Fyans, Head of Research, and Callian, for laying the intellectual foundations for our report. Talk about creating powerful communities very quickly. This is really about how we make the transfer of power to where it most matters to our communities in a way that's understandable, easy to communicate, straightforward, and easy to relate. This is a very pivotal moment in our history, in our nation's history. A nation cannot hope to enjoy peace or recover if people are overwhelmed by anxiety and feelings of helplessness. Devolution done properly should be the antidote for this. So one of our clear lessons from COVID is that one thing to be immediately grasped is when it comes to protecting the most vulnerable and generating hope in our areas, in our communities, the local and the communal must be mobilised and prioritised above the central, the top-down, and the anonymous. So really, the point we're trying to raise in the report, and I will be sending out a link so everyone gets a copy afterwards, is that if there are any lessons to be drawn from the forthcoming Recovery and Devolution White Paper, it's plainly that we must learn from the past. We can't have more Potemkin village empowerment, cardboard, cornflake box communitarianism. It's got to be real. It's got to be something we can learn from Wigan, Frome in terms of flat pack democracy, creating generally empowered people and places. And how do we do this? Well, look to the report for the findings, but what we're mainly talking about is a more relational approach to governance. Creating powerful communities requires government, both central and local, really to shift its mindset. It's a cultural thing, from the transactional and the administrative to the relational. And we could start in terms of practical terms by thinking more about participatory budgeting, people's budgets as practiced in Frome, giving local people control over resources and priorities. We also probably need strong networking and communication systems, connecting communities to the local authority and the wider ecosystem. It might require a bit of an organisational change. It might also require simplifying overly complex ways of doing things if we are to learn from previous lessons from community empowerment, and a long-term mindset when it comes to empowering communities. We also need a sense of dedication to building capacity, to making sure that social infrastructure is suitably resourced and put in the hands of communities in a way that's functionally viable, and making sure that we're linking communities to good advice when it comes to wider capital funding and administration as a good thing, building up social as well as financial capital. We talk a lot in the report about the relational, and this work has to be rooted in active listening to our communities, a commitment to linking consultations to tangible, real outcomes. And I think there's a lot we can learn here from Alison and Wigan in terms of your big listening project, to driving that cultural change that affects people's lives. And finally, when it comes to key lessons, a willingness to cede power and control and really move into a more facilitative role of the local state to engage. What we learned was most striking from our case studies is where the local state is more or less entirely facilitative, providing resources and advices to communities so they can act with independence and autonomy. That works best. So in terms of if there are any lessons to be drawn from the Devo white paper, transcending current approaches and moving towards locally specific, space-specific way of engaging with communities so that our communities, which was different as they need to be, can take on different roles. So it's a question about building capacity, social infrastructure, resourcing it through community wealth funds, and making sure the communication between councils and communities are strengthened. So that's kind of the rule from Localis. We want to open this up to a debate, and we've got a strong panel to do so. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to introduce the panelists one by one, so to really give an opportunity, 2 or 3 minutes, bullet points as to what you see as most crucial and important to creating strong communities, to empowering them against the policy and political context we have already. Then, as with all the Localis debates, we're going to open up to the audience to do their best, or in some cases their worst, through the Q&A box, to put some of the big questions to the panelists, to drive the debate through exchange and dialogue. So in terms of the batting order today, Rayhan, as a local trust representative, I'm going to ask you to go first, followed by Joe, followed by Alison, followed by Danny, and then we're going to put it out to Q&As. So without any further ado, Rayhan, we're very grateful to hear from you what you feel is most important in this agenda going forwards.
Thank you, Jonathan. And the first thing I want to say is just a huge thanks to you, to Joe, and to Callan for all your hard work in undertaking this research and putting together this report. By way of an introduction, I thought I'd just make 2 brief points on why I think this new Localis report is important to those wanting to create a country of powerful communities in the wake of COVID-19. I think the first thing to say is that this research does a very good job in interrogating history and current models of community power, both here in the UK and abroad, with the objective being to draw out the key lessons. And I have to say, it never ceases to amaze me how often policy making repeats the same mistakes time and again. So I think one good example to heed from the research is that of Toronto's strong neighbourhood strategy, which through partnerships with community groups, community businesses and other residents, invests in services, facilities and projects in 31 identified neighbourhood improvement areas, which empowers those communities through partnership-focused neighbourhood planning boards. However, for me, the most notable thing from this extensive survey of the community power landscape is how few genuinely empowering models actually exist out there. And I'm talking about level 8 or citizen control, according to Einstein's ladder of participation, where citizens hold the majority of full managerial and decision-making power. In other words, we want to see more models like the big local program where communities are autonomous and leading their own change. The second point I'd like to kind of make, and links to the first, is that for all of us who are advocates of the community power agenda, we can't just merely tinker around the edges. We need to think about a big transformative shift in power from the apparatus of central government to more local and community-based institutions. So I really welcome that this paper builds on previous work in arguing for the pop-up parish or community improvement district model to become a statutory right. It calls for more support for community groups to take on a community asset. It calls for fast emergency grants to frontline community groups. And in order to strengthen social infrastructure and properly resource endeavours to empower communities, it calls for the establishment of a community wealth fund, which would be a real game changer for the most left behind parts of this country. So let me conclude with this. Last week was kind of consumed very much by political intrigue, but the government did quietly release some new data which showed that during the height of the great lockdown early this year, 50% of people said those in their community were doing more things to help others than before the pandemic. And more than 1 in 2 said they would like to volunteer when COVID-19 restrictions end, which I think is very encouraging. But for me, what that really says is that community is power. So if there's one key takeaway from this report and this discussion today, I hope it will be that, because otherwise, as the paper says, the devolution agenda risks providing recovery without resilience and devolution without localism. So back to you, Jonathan.
Thank you, Rayhan. No, thanks again to all colleagues at Local Trust for supporting this project. Community is power, and as I always do at our events, sorry saying, I forgot to mention the hashtag at the beginning. For those using Twitter, community power is our hashtag. So thanks for reminding me, Rayhan. Joe, thank you for supporting our work earlier in the year on delivery of local services. Very keen to get your views as what you think is most important going forwards on this agenda, please.
Well, I think it's interesting the figures that Rayhan just referred to about the huge rise in volunteering and community involvement and the desire for that to become more lasting as a result of COVID. I mean, what we saw was communities rising to the challenge, the best of all the local support networks. And it worked because they were agile, they were knowledgeable, they were connected, but above all, they were trusted. And I think one of the things that comes across very, very clearly from this report, from Danny's report, from umpteen reports that we've all seen and more that will undoubtedly follow, this has got to be more than words. The language that we all use, particularly across local government and across the third sector, we talk about empowerment, we talk about consultation, we talk about engagement, we talk about co-design. But the reality for an awful lot of people, a lot of residents, is, well, my voice wasn't heard. And I think one of the things that we really need to do is to rebuild trust. And you pick on some excellent examples that Rayhan's already referred to in the report. And we've seen how trusted communities can be really, really effective in dealing with a crisis like coronavirus. You know, from, the sort of international development agenda, it's local capacity building that actually makes a difference, not pouring in lots and lots of money at government level. So I think what we need to do is to really think and be very, very honest. And I think I'll be interested to know what Alison says about this, because the fact that Wigan had a big listening project tells you more than anything, because it wasn't a big conversation, which would have been the council invariably talking to residents. It's listening, and that's the key. Councils need to be, whatever level they are, really, really honest with residents. What power do you have? What influence do you have? You know, you can't stop HS2, but you can have an influence on the things that come along with that. You might not be able to stop that new housing estate or that new school or whatever it is, but you can have an influence on the lighting, the design, the designing out crime, and those sort of things. So I think it's actually about where you can really have an influence. I think it's absolutely essential that, as you say in this, that the next report in the next white paper in next year is more than a convenient political fig leaf. We've got to trust local people. We've got to level it up. And there are many, many ways of doing this. One is by trusting and allowing people to fail, which is why Big Local works, that patient financing model. But it's also things, and Danny touches on this as well, about community assets, about paying or supporting volunteers, particularly in the deprived communities where it's very difficult to have the time and the resources to get involved if you're supposed to be getting on a bus and going to sign on in order to get your universal credit. So there's an awful lot of things, but the big takeaway for me is we've got to restore trust. And that means people at the top trusting local communities who often know better than they do.
So many thanks for your emphasis on trust, sir. It's very much appreciated. Alison, thank you for, firstly, for helping our research, joining our advisory panel letting us learn from the Wigan experience. And with that in mind, we're very keen to get your take on where we are, what you see is necessary to advance this agenda for true community empowerment.
Thank you, Jonathan. And just building on what Rayhan said, and Joe, really, I think, yeah, it is a privilege to be involved in the launch of this report and really to be able to contribute our learning and our journey in Wigan. It's certainly a journey, and I think most importantly, as Joe said, for me and for our organisation, really to listen and learn to others. So in the research, both across the UK and abroad, I think, the most important thing we've certainly learnt about, and Joe mentioned it, is the power of listening and how important that is to communities, to staff, to partners, to businesses, to local voluntary groups. But I think, the pandemic has shown, certainly in Wigan, we've certainly believed in the power of communities for a very long time, probably the past 8 or 9 years. And I say that with a real sense of, it has been a belief. It is around that movement of trying to understand the power of communities. It hasn't been a project. It isn't something that we do as a side project that seems a good thing to do to tick some boxes in terms of that engagement and, residents. It is around that completely different approach and a sort of a different thinking and a different philosophy. But through COVID, we've really seen even more the evidence and power of communities. 800 new volunteers stepping forward, WhatsApp groups being formed, humanitarian aid groups, Facebook groups, real innovation, and where people have really come to the fore. And no more than now, I think it's important that we understand what power the communities have. So in Wigan, really, for many years, the Wigan deal that is quoted within the report and talked about has been around that strong narrative of understanding that different relationship between citizens, communities, people, and what that means with the public sector and authorities, both within the local council and within central government. And it's really ultimately around understanding things in a completely different way. And it's around having a different conversation that we've been doing for a long, long time, which is based on listening. Really looking at a lens through ethnography. So we've tried to show that we consider the whole person, the whole community, thinking about the positives and the assets, and not traditionally a tick-based negative sort of approach to looking at needs. It's really understanding communities, and I think that's where the Big Listening Project came in, really understanding and listening to residents. That's been a strong factor. Connecting and building community capacity. So for the last 8 or 9 years, it's around investment, and we know that communities need that investment. So we've invested just over £10 million now into community groups. But that's around their innovation and permissions to do things differently, and knowing that the council doesn't have all the answers. And actually, what's certainly shown us over a number of years now, that community groups have the best solutions by them taking control, by letting them run whatever community group it is. They do have much more understanding and much better approaches, and it's having that confidence in some respects to let go and let that innovation happen, and knowing that that takes some leadership, and people can feel a little bit worried about it, particularly those perhaps who have been democratically elected, and that's a sort of shift in that approach. But by having those different relationships and building that that relationship through the deal with our residents and communities, and trying to get the permissions to work differently, it's shown some amazing results. And that new model of commissioning and community investment, where we can get that market development and new arrangements, has shown that communities do flourish. We've seen over 500 new community groups in our borough come forward over the last few years, and they're doing amazing things and taking control of their own communities. So obviously, as we explore the conversation over the next hour or so, happy to go in more detail, but some simple messages around it is a movement, and it is about listening, and it is about a real sense of that permission to do things differently and really believing in it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alison. Thank you especially for all colleagues at Wigan for, I don't think anything communicates in life like actual proof of something working strongly in practice. That's very strong yardstick, touchstone for our colleagues to look to. So last speaker, Danny Kruger, thank you so much for joining us today. A lot of our report was very much inspired and influenced by your report, Levelling Up Our Communities. So great privilege and honour to introduce you and to get your take on where things stand at this current time, Danny.
Thank you. Well, it's very good to be with you, and great to have a chance to listen to all of that first, because I completely agree with everything that others have been saying, Ryan and Joe and Alison, who I've spoken to a number of times, and her predecessor at Wigan, Donna. I mean, it's just the most tremendous evidence of what can be done, and very pleased to see your report, Jonathan, with which I agree with everything. Let me, rather than sort of repeating points others have made or going into the policy recommendations, just try and give you a bit of a sense of how I would frame this politically and what I think the opportunity is to embed this in what government does and what MPs discuss. I mean, the glory of this is that both political traditions, left and right, can legitimately claim this agenda. And what I want to see is a battle over who owns it, rather than a sort of cozy, yes, we all agree, you know, with that nice little stuff around community. Now let's get on with discussing the big boys stuff, like, you know, tax or trains. Actually, let's have a fight over who has the best claim to community power. And you know, the left have a very long tradition. In fact, perhaps their governing idea is a sense of injustice that needs to be fixed by a bottom-up revolution, which can be, you know, peaceful and democratic, against established power, and that narrative speaks very strongly to this work. And there is a sort of insurgent element to it, a sort of revolutionary or radical dimension here, which I as a Tory find exciting and compelling, but it should certainly energise the left. And on our side, you know, we have a tradition as Tories of, it goes back to Disraeli, who talked about trusting the people. And not all Tories, even then, well, certainly not then, agreed with that idea. They thought the elite was in charge for a reason. But Disraeli said, no, we can do better than that. Actually, if we trust the people, we'll find that they are better at managing life, and we'll actually get better outcomes, but also they'll vote for us. And he was right about that. And you know, the long hegemony of the Conservative Party in the 20th century, I think, is down to that insight. And Maggie Thatcher renewed it with a focus on trusting people's entrepreneurial instinct. So I think we can and should claim community power as part of our tradition as well. I think this is the latest evolution. If Disraeli began the process of enfranchising the majority of the population and Thatcher liberated the economy, what we need in our time as Conservatives is to speak for the empowerment of communities, not purely through the democratic process that Disraeli was responsible for, or through market processes, which Thatcher did, but through a much, perhaps more complicated and messy sort of policy agenda around neighbourhood empowerment and giving opportunities for people to act together, to take back control, and feel a sense of belonging and agency. So I think there's some good politics here, is what I'm trying to get at. And I've talked about the radical consensus in the past. I think there is a sort of consensus between parts of the two traditions. You obviously have your centralisers and your individualists and your free marketeers and your statists, for whom this is all anathema. But actually there is a big chunk of Parliament who have crossed the aisle that gets this, and we're developing this consensus, I think. Just staying on politics for a moment, my concern, I'd be interested in people's views, is what I think of as the Ed Miliband effect. Miliband, who was also sort of on this agenda, had the idea of doing it in the Labour Party, and he opened up the Labour Party to what you might call community power. He said you don't have to be a member to vote for the next leader. And then we got Jeremy Corbyn, and the Labour Party was infiltrated by a sect, quite an extremist sect, who represented a minority of the public opinion, but they were very active and highly politicised. And I don't have I recognise the anxiety. I don't believe it will happen, but I recognise that some of my colleagues would think this is what we're going to do to our country. We're going to create opportunities for all the loonies to take over local institutions and start running things in interests of sectional interest. And they're not necessarily on the hard left. So I'm just concerned about how to frame the politics in a way that is successful. Just to finish with sort of where we are, I think from a policy perspective, there's a devolution white paper coming. I think that could be a very helpful opportunity to for the government. I hope the government to embrace this and to whether they go down the route of more mayors, more unitary councils, which I'd be supportive of in principle, but it feels to me this is actually a more exciting agenda and a more fruitful way of devolving power. And as you put it, Jonathan, we need devolution with localism. We need to properly have a sense the communities are driving what happens locally. And the other big opportunity is in fiscal policy, and as and when we get a longer proper spending review, to look at the way that we incentivise the patient deployment of capital into the places that need it. And that feels to me the big prize, is how do we get the vast amount of private capital that looks around for investment to support this agenda. And I think using public money, also dormant assets, other sources, the lottery and so on, in a way that incentivizes and encourages private capital, I think could be very helpful. And then finally, neighbourhood planning. So there's again a white paper around the planning system, which does emphasise the importance of neighbourhood planning and more neighbourhood plans. Whether it's going to really give them the power they need is to be seen. But I think there are some sort of political, legislative moments coming down the track that we who agree with this agenda should be trying to hijack and make happen. Thank you.
Danny, thank you very much indeed for framing that response on both the political and the policy realities behind all this. That's very helpful indeed. Well, colleagues, you've heard from our panellists, and I think you've got a very good impression of across the board of what's important here: community power, trust, listening, as well as some of the many political asks, the fiscal, localist, and the political. We're going to throw it out to you now for the Q&A. You've got a Q&A box. Do your best, do your worst. There's never anything such a thing as a silly question, only a more or less ridiculous answer, but we'll try and do our best here. I've got an initial question from Claire Richards, asking us if we can provide a definition of social infrastructure. Is it just around planning, amenities and services? What are we really talking about here? Any takers for that, first of all? Jo?
Well, just a thought on this, and I think it's a really important point that Claire raises. And it's something that other speakers have touched on a little bit, and I absolutely agree with Danny that we need to hijack the planning proposals that are coming through, because one of the things that has come out very, very clearly from the pandemic is this need and desire for space, whether it's a garden, a park, whatever it is. What we have lost over the last 20, 30, 40 years, particularly in urban areas, are those areas of civic public space. And that shared space is really important. Now, it might be a park, it might be a library, it might be a walkway. What you see in London particularly are areas where private developers have moved in and have privatised parts of land that used to be open for people. It would seem to me that that would be quite a good way to think about social infrastructure, is about those shared spaces. But it's also about looking at the mixed communities. It's about sustainable communities. So, for instance, if you have a borough, let's say, where young people can't afford to buy houses there or rent houses there, they will move away. If you are in a position to do something with affordable housing or better job opportunities or those sort of opportunities, you can actually encourage those people to stay in the community. It becomes a more sustainable community. The more churn there is, the less resilient communities are, simply because the people aren't around with the knowledge and the experience. So I think social infrastructure does go with bricks and mortar. It also goes with things about about the facilities and amenities, but they don't have to be built spaces. They can be shared spaces, virtually as well as really, and that's what I think is really important and is often missed in planning.
Thank you very much. Rayhan, you've got your finger up, take it on.
Hey, Jonathan, and I think Joe's just kind of done a great job there in defining what social infrastructure is. I guess I just kind of like add one additional thing, and that's we teamed up recently with Survation to do some polling. We think it's the first ever polling in Left Behind Britain. So local trusts have identified 225 neighbourhoods across England, which are categorised as left behind. So they're lacking in kind of social infrastructure, they're lacking in civic engagement, and they have poor connectivity, as well as being very deprived, so falling within the top 10% of the IMDb 2019. And we asked those people whether they felt that the areas get their fair share, and a sizable chunk said no. And we then asked them to identify the area that was missing out on investment most, and that was places to meet and community facilities like leisure and sporting facilities. So I think that just shows how important kind of places to meet, like pubs, like community cafes, like libraries, like youth centres, are to people in these types of communities.
Thank you very much, Rayhan. Alison, please. What's your take?
Yeah, well, I think just building on what Joe and Rayhan said, I agree with all of that. And I think then beyond that, it's what can you do in terms of being a local authority. So for many years, we've worked on a really sort of listening to our communities around not always having that public service solution. So by engaging and doing the listening, understanding what they need to thrive, often it is that space and that social infrastructure, and then developing that sort of investment. Can you do community asset transfers? Where can they come forward? And we've got so many examples of community groups now running former day centres, acting as community centres, and really being the sort of heart of that community and what goes on there for everybody to come in and do different activities of all ages. We've got public places like Pennington Hall and a park there where the volunteers have taken over a community cafe, and that's run by volunteers, and they really then extend that and use and encourage use of the rest of the park facilities. And the stories go on of how we've tried to make sure that actually it's community groups and newly formed volunteering groups or social enterprises that become the solutions, rather than traditionally seeing it's the local council stepping in and commissioning and procuring a service. So I think it's thinking things differently around what that social infrastructure looks like, and then I suppose facilitating a different approach and making sure that you try and often get through the bureaucracy that we've created over many years, and be that supportive sort of organisation who can really help on some of that community infrastructure. Thank you.
Thank you, Alison. Finally, Danny, you covered a lot of this ground in levelling up our communities. What's your take on what we should define as social infrastructure, including perhaps, as Claire asked, informal social infrastructure?
Well, I think, it's an elastic term, but it is pretty meaningful. And it's what I like about it is it's both it's an old idea but it can have very new forms. So we're talking about, as people have said, traditional public spaces and facilities. The gathering places of our communities. But they can perform a pretty modern-looking function as well. I like the opportunity with what's going on in towns and high streets to repurpose buildings and places as social infrastructure, and they can be commercial. We can talk about co-working spaces or maker spaces and pop up this and that, but their function is essentially about gathering and collective action. But I'd like to see churches more, buildings for social purpose, like churches being used for community functions. I mean, I'm a bit of an enemy of pews because I think they get in the way of what you could use a church, not just one day a week, but every day for all sorts of really positive projects, as happens, of course, in loads and loads of places. Libraries, very excited by the potential of libraries as both very traditional places of learning and belonging, but also to be the hub of enterprise startup, and also crucially digital. And that's the other dimension to this, which is we need a digital lens on social infrastructure. And our civil society needs a lot of help and investment to become more digital. And we have 9 million people who are not on the internet at all, and civil society can be the great agency of support for them. So I think it's a term we all need to sort of inhabit ourselves, as it were, and just become. It needs to be very much part of the common parlance. Is how strong is social infrastructure in a place, and as I say, that can be quite both traditionalist and quite modern.
Thank you. Alison, you want to come back?
Sorry, I couldn't turn my mic off. Just to build on what Danny said very, very briefly. So we bought a shopping centre in the middle of our Wigan town centre, the biggest one. Virtually every shop was closed. So walking through, fairly depressing for local residents. But the power then to turn that into a cultural hub. The council was there to facilitate, but it was the local artists, local creative groups, local dance groups, local choirs, local bands, local makerspace groups who really did all the thinking. They put all the effort in. Our job was to get through, I suppose, the red tape and make it happen as the owner and of the buildings, really. So I think it shows the power of when you want to think differently, but you don't let in essence the council's not in control. You let the community take control of what they want to use that space for. And now it's become, obviously COVID makes it difficult, but it's become a vibrant hub. People didn't walk through that shopping centre. Now it's flooded with 30,000 visitors pre-COVID, where people are coming in, getting interested in art, looking at different things, bands there. It's just amazing, but it does take a different mindset and a leap forward into thinking about things and not seeing the council as the solution, but the council to help the community to facilitate what it can become. Thank you.
Thank you very much for another strong, concrete example from Wigan, Alison. Very much appreciated. Now, I've got plenty of questions in the Q&A box. Many of it's like party conferences to get more comments than questions. But I'll cherry pick a couple of them. David Farnsworth and Stephen Robinson essentially raising the central political point. Are these arguments going to get a hearing in central government? And does devolution with localism mean anything, given the tendency of national governments to be localists in opposition, but centralisers in power? Anyone want to have a go at that?
Shall I have a go?
Go on, Danny, thank you.
I mean, I think that's why we need, quite rightly, this change needs to happen because of pressure from below. So, just as I didn't want my report to be sort of suddenly adopted by government and said, right, great, we've worked out what the communities need. It's the Danny Kruger proposals here. That's what we're going to do. We need a proper conversation that makes the right ideas. I mean, Paul, I agree with everything you've put, Jonathan, in your report. Nor would it be appropriate for any minister just to suddenly take a set of proposals and implement them. We need to develop plans that will work, and we can only do that through really effective bottom-up, making it happen. So what I'm getting at is, I think that the more we can all do to put this agenda on the radar of the government, and that's through Parliament as much as anything, opposition parties making the same point, I think we can get there. But yes, there's definitely, and I've had a very positive response to my report. Whether it'll kind of get through all of the fog and challenge of the immediate challenges that government has, I don't know. But I think it's going to be I'm hoping that over the course of the next coming months and into next year, people will increasingly see that building back better is not just about sort of, boosting the economy and getting the vaccine. It's about building on this incredible sort of community power revolution that we've seen this year. So the more we can promote it, the better.
Thank you very much for going first dibs there. Jo, you've got your pen raised, please.
Yeah, just I think one of the things that comes out of this very clearly is that we all broadly agree, but one of the problems that all of us will be very well aware of is the demise of local papers and the demise of those local news services, whether it's local radio or whatever it is. I mean, I know it varies from shire to county to town and what have you, but it's about how people are informed. And I think this goes back to Danny's point about the Ed Miliband effect. I thought you were going to talk about bacon sandwiches for a moment, but they got into the Labour Party or disrupted the Labour Party, if you like, because they were very well organised on social media. We need to be, those of us that care and are committed to sort of community power and localism, need to also be so agile. And I think one of the good things about, if there's anything good that's come out of coronavirus that Rehan and I were talking about before we went live, is the fact that people can participate in events like this, whereas maybe they couldn't have done. Maybe they wouldn't have all travelled to London or Wigan, wherever it was, but actually they can do it between meetings. It doesn't take a whole morning. And so there's a participatory effect that I think is much greater, and that's reaching a wider number of people. If people have access to information, then they're better informed. All councils carry out residents and borough and county surveys. They should be using all of that data. They should be stripping it to the bone, so that when there is, if we're ever back in normal times, for instance, a public meeting about a big planning proposal, you don't just do it in the obvious village hall or town hall or whatever. You actually look at the areas from your resident survey and say, okay, here's an area where people don't use the internet. That's where we need to have the meeting. And that's the agility and the thinking. But it is about this somehow or other, and I think this is where we're going to struggle. We've got to get networks together so that people are aware of what's going on and come together. And that, now's the time to do it, where we're all using social media and digital connections much, much more.
Thank you very much, Jo. Rehan, would you like to leap in?
Nothing really to add. I guess what I would say is that I do feel more optimistic this week than perhaps last week. I think government is moving to a different approach to policy making. The 10 Downing Street's kind of announced that they're going to create a new policy board. It's going to be chaired by Neil O'Brien, who's very committed to the levelling up agenda. It sounds like government's going to be opening up more and kind of, I think, working with kind of different sectors like civil society. So I do feel more optimistic about kind of like the potential for us to kind of really deliver on our agenda. But nothing else to add.
Thank you, Rehan. Alison, obviously, as a local authority chief executive, you've been on the anvil of all this between local and central over the last 8 months more than any time. Do you see any sort of embers of hope for a resetting of things?
I'm a positive person, so I always look for the hope, even though it's been a very, very difficult 8 to 9 months. But I think so. I think people are understanding the power of communities much more, and I think it's how we grasp those opportunities and don't let them go. So going back to what Jo said, certainly I think as a council we need to reflect on what we can do differently. We did a big listening project about a year ago where I suppose it wasn't a traditional survey. We had a big green sofa and it went out into the park, into shopping centres, into GPs, into the hospital, into schools, you name it, across many, many locations, probably 100 locations across the borough. And it was just about listening and listening to what people had to say in our communities. But I think that deeper analysis, as Jo said, is important. And then how do we create in this this post-COVID world, more spaces for listening and what can we do. Embracing technology in particular has shown that we can come together much quicker, and certainly our staff and partners are saying how technology has really embraced that. So I think there is hope and positivity that we can build on all of the the great work that we've seen, and particularly how communities have stepped up so much, and how we grasp that.
Thank you very much, Alison. Danny made the point earlier that sort of this agenda means different things to different parts of the political spectrum, but from a place perspective, there's a difference too. So I'm going to cut and shut two questions. One from Tony Smith from West Midlands Combined Authority. We've got a couple of doubles and trebles. He makes the point that in the West Midlands Combined Authority submission to the devolution white paper, they're calling for double and triple devolution to local authorities and communities. Tony asks, does the panel agree we need a more complex approach to Devo, and what might white paper need to do to take that forward? And obviously this agenda's got to work in rural areas as much as urban centres. So Jane Wills from Cornwall says that double Devo's taken off in Cornwall, town and parishes taken over parks, toilets, community centres, libraries in a very effective way, and possibly running them to a higher standard than before. Do these need to be created in our urban areas, as in pop-up parishes? So really, we started off with double devolution, we've got a treble for everyone to take it on. How do you make this work in rural and urban areas, and what do we ideally need to see in the Devo white paper to realise the promise, the potential of full community participation? Want to take that on first, Danny?
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, you have to tell us to speak. Well, I think that is right, and we do need a more complicated idea of devolution than just a sort of chunking down of power from Westminster to the upper tier local authorities, and I think that is our challenge, and it makes it harder to say what we mean in this space. You see people's eyes glaze over when they start talking about social infrastructure and devolution and so on, but it's also the excitement, because it can be real, and there's huge amounts of opportunity for innovation this way. So yes, I think we need a messier idea of what devolution is. Just we need a more patient idea of how change happens, and a more collaborative one than just some kind of hero actor leader coming in and fixing everything. I've suggested in my report that we need a Community Power Act, which would be an act of Parliament that puts an obligation. I ripped this idea off like I ripped off all my ideas from other people. This one, I think, came from a New Local Government Network, New Local as they now are, Adam Lent, who suggested a Community Power Act. And what my idea of that is an obligation on all public agencies, whether local government or public services, to effectively work out how to give power away and to engage communities in the design and, where appropriate, the delivery of their services. And rather like the Social Value Act puts an obligation on commissioners to think about how they use public money, we need a more profound obligation on the public sector to do this. Just lastly on urban and rural, I think many of the best ideas they start in the country and end up in the city. So community land trusts, which I think is a huge opportunity to transform housing, began in Scotland 100 years ago, and it's now a really inspiring model in urban areas. I think the same goes for pop-up parishes. Actually, that idea, the phrase, I think, came from Tony Travers at the LSE, and the Centre for London to pick that up. So that idea, which yes does happen in lots of interesting ways in the countryside, is perfectly appropriate to urban areas as well. I mean, it can be more challenging when you haven't got such settled homogenous communities, but the model is just as powerful, I think.
Thank you very much for a full response there. Jo, your pencil is up there, please.
Again, I
Yes.
know. Well, I couldn't agree more about the importance of rural and non-urban areas. I mean, I'm speaking to you from Kent. You know, it could be the Garden of England, but in actual fact, just 15 minutes down the road is one of the most deprived wards in the whole of the country. And that's, you know, the left behind seaside coastal resorts. So there are really, really big problems in different areas, and I don't think there's a one size fits all, which is why in answer to the question, yes, it needs to be complex, but not complex that means that councillors and council officials have to go into silos to spend hours working out the procedure and writing reports that no one will ever read. It's about being, you know, it comes back to this word agile again. And I think, you know, rural communities in particular have had to be agile and resilient and self-sufficient. In many, many ways. They tend not to, I speak as a farmer's daughter, so I'm slightly biased here, but they tend not to rely on the state, whether it's the town council, local council, or whoever it is. They tend to do things themselves, whether it's, you know, clearing up litter, hedge cutting, whatever, keeping the park clean and tidy. So those sort of things are quite important. And I think, you know, we get into this point of civic responsibility. It can't all come from the top. It can't all come from whatever layer of devolution. It does actually have to come from people. And it comes from people walking along the street and actually picking up the litter that they see and putting it in a bin instead of walking past it. And very, very briefly, again, to make it easier and more acceptable to the people who will, or the organisations that will ultimately introduce and create new levels of community and localism. It goes back to this thing about data. We need to find a really good way of measuring and showing the value of social impact and social value. You know, we're getting there. We can do it a little bit on things like public art. We can do it a little bit on social prescribing in the health sector, but we need to put that in and embed it into all the evaluations that we make.
Some very strong, good points there, Jo. Thank you very much. Rayhan, double, triple, quadruple, where does it end?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just quickly just point out what we want to see in the local.
We do really want to see, and it's in your paper.
I'm afraid we're sort of losing you, Rayhan.
Okay, can you hear me now?
That's a bit better, yes.
So yeah, so just want to pick up on the point about what we want to see in the local recovery and devolution white paper. So something that we really want to see is what's actually in this paper, which is that we want to see a strengthening of community rights in terms of acquiring assets and social infrastructure. Because at the moment, it's actually very hard for a community to take on a you know, kind of community asset or, you know, some form of social infrastructure. I mean, they have to raise the money themselves, and they have a very limited window as well in which to kind of like secure it. So I think that, you know, we need to move to a position where it's almost like the default. So, you know, the community is actually supported to kind of like take on the asset if that's what they want, but also they're given the kind of means and the resources to do so.
Thank you very much, Rayhan. Finally, Alison, from your perspective in Wigan, what would your ideal recipe be for the devolution white paper? What do you see from the reality of the ground where you are as to what's necessary to push this out as extensively as possible?
I mean, obviously, white papers and the debate and the things that we've talked about today are very important, but there's nothing more important than getting on with it. And I think that goes back to culture and belief and the way you see things. So I think, you know, we can keep talking about devolution, we can keep talking about, you know, different models, but actually in the meantime, I think there's a real necessity to get on with it and prove by doing so, you know, removing the blockages, making things happen, having a real belief in it. You know, we're doing so many things across ethical community living with housing providers, in our procurement, making sure we're thinking about community-based solutions rather than traditional solutions. And I think it goes back to what I sort of said at the beginning. It's a sense that this is a movement, really. It's a sense that you believe in it. And I think that's the hurdle that people have got to get over. And it's that mindset issue, isn't it? And a cultural change. So for me, that would be a sort of lasting message about actually, let's just get on with it and keep doing it. So you've got the proof there. You can build what Joe said around some of the social value. You can show the economics behind it. It's actually about getting on and doing it.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Alison. Very conscious of time now. Very conscious. I've got some more questions that we could. It's like questions thought. There are more questions than answers when it comes to this webinar. But look, for those questions we've got there, we will try to answer them as quick as soon as we can. We'll also send a copy of the report. One quick question for you, Danny. I've got a question from James Wright asking any idea what's happened to the community ownership fund. If you could put him out of his misery there, that might be one way.
Well, I mean, it's in the manifesto, so you know, we've got to do it. So yeah, I mean, there's two big prizes in this space: community ownership fund and the community housing fund, which I'm really keen that we renew. Both of them big opportunities to drive this agenda. But you know, all I can say is it'll. I mean. We promised to do it, so I'm sure it's in the works. But sorry not to be more clear than that. I'm also trying to find out.
But can't say fairer than that. Well, look, I think we've pretty much reached the limits for today. I'd just like to express my heartfelt gratitude to our fantastic panel, Joe, Rayhan, Alison and Danny. We very much hope at the Carlis we can help to advance this agenda to the white paper and beyond. Any further thoughts, feedback from our report, please get in touch to us. We're very delighted to hear from you. And without any further ado, we shall call proceedings to a halt now. But thanks to everyone for attending today. Thanks for your contributions. We'll get back to you with our Q&As and take it from there. So, class dismissed. Thank you very much.